Hey, and welcome everybody to today's debate. Today we'll be going over one of anthropology's biggest questions for the decade. How did the first states emerge? So to debate this question, I've invited two anthropologists with very different points today to come speak their minds. First, we'll have Gordon Childe V, representing the urban revolutionary theory, arguing that agriculture and economic development actually led to cities and states. And opposing him, we also have Robert Carnero here, who argues that warfare, population pressure, and environmental constraints, and not just agriculture alone, is what created the first states. After hearing both arguments, we'll return with a host of a short podcast and go over each theory using evidence from their published writings. All right, thank you guys for having me today. My name is Gordon Childe V. My argument today will begin with the greatest turning point in human history, which is known as the Agricultural Revolution. Starting off, one of my first points would be that once humans learned to cultivate crops and domesticate animals, societies were able to consistently produce more food than they needed. So this surplus is what eventually led to the change of everything, because not everyone had to farm anymore. Some people became potters, some became metalworkers, merchants, priests, architects, and etc. Society then became more specialized. As this specialization grew, villages grew into cities, and cities required planning in order for them to grow. Organization and record keeping, as well as leadership, these factors were all needed in order for cities to grow, as we know today. Over time, these institutions developed into governments that were capable of managing into complex societies. These complex societies are what led to states. And in my article, I actually describe what I call the urban revolution, which is a transformation where increased food production, called a surplus, actually supported these specializations into forming. And so technological innovation, trade, and political organization all were factors until the first civilizations emerged. They were created because obviously increasing complexity in these societies, these large cities, these forming states, they required these complex forms of leadership and administration. Without these, obviously, the societies wouldn't form and states wouldn't emerge without all these factors playing into it, but it all came down from the surplus production of agriculture and increased food supply. Yeah, interesting points from Mr. Childe over here. I'll be going over my points now. Thank you guys for the introduction. My name is Robert Carnero. And first off, I just want to start off by saying, while Professor Childe did recognize that the importance of agriculture and its significance, I actually believe that his explanation leaves out the most important question that we've all been wondering. If agriculture naturally created these states, Mr. Childe, then why did thousands of farming societies remain independent villages for centuries? I mean, as we know, agriculture existed long before the states appeared so clearly. So clearly something else must explain why states formed only in certain specific places. And one of the points I want to start off by saying, the answer to this question, I believe to be circumscription. As we know, in regions surrounded by mountains, deserts, and oceans, people could not simply move away after losing a conflict. Warfare had permanent consequences, as we know, and defeated communities then became subjects of these victors over them. Repeated conquests and larger political systems emerged until states formed at this point, not just due to agriculture. As I explained in my article, agriculture alone can't account for the state formation because many agricultural societies, as we know, never actually developed centralized governments. Instead, something called population pressure combined with these circumscribed environments, and then warfare explains where and why these earliest states arose. So with that being said, Professor Childe, I just have one question for you. Your theory assumes agriculture produces civilization, yet anthropologists have documented many farming communities that never became states themselves. How does your theory explain that? Yeah, that's a good question, Mr. Carnero. Well, to answer your question, my point is that agriculture doesn't create states overnight, obviously. It creates the conditions that are necessary for specialization. As I mentioned already, as surplus increases, societies become more interconnected, and so trades further expand and technologies then improve. That's pretty intuitive. But as we know, religious and political institutions then became increasingly organized, and state formation then happened gradually at this point. It didn't just happen in the snap of a finger. It's the overall effect of growing economic stability and the complexity of these states that were emerging, Mr. Carnero. So, with that being said, Mr. Carnero, I actually have a question for you. Um, since we know warfare has existed throughout human history, if warfare created states, then why didn't every society experiencing conflict develop into one? That's because warfare alone isn't sufficient enough. We know that, Mr. Childy. My theory depends upon circumscription. Like I said, when defeated groups have somewhere else to go or to migrate to, they leave so that their political conquest ends up failing. But when their escape obviously fails due to mountains, deserts, oceans, all these barriers, or even surrounding populations that end up stopping them in their tracks, they'll have to submit to them. These repeated conquests obviously create centralized authority. Yet your theory emphasizes conflict while overlooking cooperation. Excuse me for interrupting you, but great civilizations depended on irrigation, trade networks, skilled craftsmen, and religion. So your point isn't really all there, Mr. Carnero. None of these emerged from warfare by itself. Okay, yeah, fair point, Mr. Childy. I agree that those institutions are essential, but they explain how states function and not why they emerge in the first place, is what we're getting at here. Political integration required conquest, and without a driving force that were forcing these villagers into larger political units, obviously specialization alone can't explain the archaeological evidence. Yes, but civilization represents humanity's greatest economic achievement, and agriculture created surplus, which I said creates specialization, therefore creating cities, and cities needed governments. The state was the natural outcome of increasing human complexity, like I said 3 times now, and cooperation. This is what I'm trying to get at. Okay, and history shows agriculture was necessary but not sufficient. States emerged where populations pressure, limited land, and warfare forced political unity. Conflict, not cooperation alone, best explains why the earliest states appeared when they did. Completely disregarding your point right now. Okay, guys. I think you guys have both said enough. We get your points. So now that we've heard both of your guys' perspectives, we can now compare the evidence that's supported in your guys' articles. Okay, guys, now that the debate is over, this is me, Kevin Menchaca, speaking. I'll be going over the PDFs of what I've highlighted to show you guys where I gathered my arguments in playing the roles of Robert Carnero and Gordon Childy. So in the Childy PDF, I highlighted these paragraphs right here because they discuss the points he made about surplus, specialization, and urban development. As we can see, Childy's theory follows on progression, and he stated in the first and second paragraph how agriculture increased food production and that surplus ultimately supported people who didn't have to farm full time anymore, because since it was a new economy, as we can see highlighted right there. And then we can move on to page 6, which is down here. Yes, and then we can go down here. So where it says, one result of the urban revolution will be to rescue such specialists from nomadism and guarantee them security in a new social organization. So rescuing these defeated peoples or nomads, obviously due to them losing their land, and guarantee them security in a new social organization, meaning growth. I also highlighted Indus had begun to yield a social surplus, which was large enough to support a number of resident specialists who were themselves released from food production, and at the same time dependence on river water for the irrigation of the crops restricted the cultivatable areas, while the necessity of canalizing the waters and protecting habitations against annual floods encouraged the aggregation of population. Big point right here. And then it says, thus arose the first cities, units of settlement 10 times as great as any known Neolithic village. And it can be argued that all cities in the old world are offshoots of those: Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Basin. And then going forward, starting on page 11 on the PDF, we can see right here that he discusses that cities are larger than villages, going over dense populations, as we can see I highlighted right here. But this is where it actually, he starts talking about the 10 characteristics of an urban civilization, which are very important in his points that I went over, and discussing on how he fortifies his point on why this agricultural expansion is actually what led to the states emerging. So that's one. I don't want to go over two because there's a lot, but I highlighted 2 and 3 as we can read in through here. I just don't want the video to be too long. Thus, you can see concentrated the surplus, more on that, urban populations. Right here on the 4th one, he makes that truly monumental public buildings, like monumental architectures, distinguish each known city from any village, but they also symbolize the concentration of the social surplus. And then Harappa, for example, in the Indus Basin, was dominated by an artificial citadel girt with a massive rampart of kin-baked bricks, containing presumably a palace and immediately overlooking an enormous granary and the barracks of artisans. I didn't include this directly in the debate, but this just goes on to fortify his points and where I pulled my evidence from. And then 5, not engaged in food production, in the first instance by the surplus accumulated. And I pretty much just highlighted all those points. And with the invention of writing, everything that's important about these 10 characteristics that formed his idea of what created the first states. All right, and then we can move on to the Carnero PDF. I highlighted this on page 2 because this is where he actually explains a part of Childe's theory. And I highlight specifically where he says, the principal difficulty with this theory and forward, because he states how agriculture doesn't produce surplus. And this is his main point that we can go off of. And then if we can continue down here to the circumscription paragraph, as we can see, or it says, sorry, this was the previous point, still going off of that agriculture doesn't immediately produce surplus. But going down to this section, I highlighted this where he explains when people lose a war, how they can't flee, and they actually become subjects, which then allows states to emerge because then they incorporate them into those societies. Not too much on that, but you could tell in my debate, his centralized argument was mainly centralized around these points, as we can see down here as well. And then finally, we can go down to the last page and we see how he says, in summary and beyond that, he concludes this last page with circumscription, mentioning population pressure and warfare and how it actually amounts to the origin of the state, which closes off his point entirely. But that pretty much concludes my debate and my analysis of the PDFs where I got my evidence and arguments from. But that pretty much concludes my debate. Hopefully I can turn this in without any problems. But thank you.